One of the first things that Lenin did in December of 1917, within a month of seizing power, since the hold on power was tenuous at best, was that, well, you were going to need some kind of organization to infiltrate and suppress those pesky counter-revolutionaries and foreign imperialists and all of the other enemies that we have. And so the Extraordinary Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, the Cheka, was formed. You put a veteran Bolshevik, Felix Dzerzhinsky, at the head of that, someone you could politically rely upon, but Dzerzhinsky built his organization essentially out of the Okhrana. I mean, there were all of these informers sitting around with nothing to do, and they were employed. In the early 20s, the kind of rank and file of the Cheka might have been 80 to 90% former imperial officials. Those were gradually decreased over time. So why would they do that? Well, they were professionals. They also needed to eat, and things were somewhat precarious. So if your job is to be an agent provocateur, or if your job is to infiltrate targeted organizations and lead them astray, you do that for whoever pays you. That's part of the professionalism which goes in. And under the Soviets, the Soviet intelligence services are also very good at that. They're very good at infiltrating people into opposing organizations. And I guess the one example I would give to demonstrate that are the Cambridge Five, the British traitors, from Soviet standpoint, heroes, who were recruited, most notably Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Anthony Blunt, and there may have been well more than five, but that wasn't bad out of just Cambridge. And then placing those people in high positions, the ultimate goal, of course, is to get your people into positions of leadership and influence in the opposing intelligence service. And so they did. Of course, it all fell apart, and they ended up Philby ended up living the last part of his life in exile in Moscow, but they got their money's worth out of him. And you can also find this in KGB infiltration of the CIA, the FBI, the Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen cases. Of course, we were infiltrating. By we, I mean the Americans in the West managed to infiltrate our moles as well. But if it came down, someone could dispute this, but I would think if you were going to come down to a kind of like a who had the most moles Super Bowl, probably the Soviets would come somewhat ahead of that.
So the scale of the infiltration, the number of people, and the skill of it. Is there a case to be made that the Okhrana and the Cheka orchestrated both the components of the Russian Revolution as you described them?
Well, there's an interesting question for me. I mean, there are all kinds of questions about this. I mean, one of the questions is whether or not Lenin was an Okhrana agent. Okay, I've just said heresy. Some people, I'll do that quite often because I am a heretic and proud of it.
Great.
Why would you possibly say that Lenin could have been an Okhrana agent? Well, let's look what he managed to do. So you had, coming into the 20th century, nominally a single Marxist movement, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, majorityites and minorityyites, are merely factions of that party. And they always agreed that they were all Marxists, and we all believe in dialectical materialism and the rise of we're all socialists, comrade. The difference was the tactical means by which one would attain this. And what Lenin wanted was a militant small-scale vanguard party. He wanted a revolution. He wanted to seize power, seize control of the state. And once you have the state, then you induce socialism from above. Whereas the majority of the people, the so-called Mensheviks, the minorityites, who are, oddly enough, the vast majority of the party, that's one of the first things. How do you lose that argument? Okay, how does the minority get to grab the name majorityites? But Lenin did that. So what Lenin wanted was a conspiratorial party of committed revolutionaries that would plot and scheme and undermine and eventually seize control of the state and induce socialism from above. There were other Russian Marxists who thought that that sounded vaguely totalitarian and not really democratic and not even terribly socialist. And they opposed that ineffectively from the beginning, outmaneuvered every step of the way. The Mensheviks are a case study in failure of a political organization. That too will be heresy to some people, but look, they lost. Now, so what Lenin managed to do, starting around 1903, continuing on to this, is he managed to divide, to take what had been a single Marxist party and split it into angry, contending factions. Because he and his Bolsheviks were on one side, advocating a much more militant conspiratorial policy. The discombobulated Mensheviks were over on the other, and in between were a lot of people who really didn't know where they stood on this. I mean, sometimes they kind of agreed, and he seems to be making sense today. No, I don't think he's making sense in that day. But he managed to completely disunify this organization. Now, who could possibly have seen benefit in that? The Okhrana. Now, whether or not they put him up to it, whether or not in some way they helped move him into a position of leadership or encouraged it through people around him, whether he was a witting or unwitting agent of the Tsar's secret police, he certainly accomplished exactly what it was that they have wanted. And I find that suspicious. It's one of those things that it's so convenient in a way is that I'm not necessarily sure that was an accident. There's also this whole question to me as to what was going on within the Okhrana itself. Now, this is one of these questions we might come to later about how intelligence agencies interact or serve the governments to which they are theoretically subordinate. They do tend to acquire a great deal of influence and power. After all, their main job is to collect information. And that information could be about all kinds of things, including people within the government structure itself. And they also know how to leverage that information in a way to get people to do what you want them to do. So an argument can be made, again, an argument, not a fact, merely an opinion, which is mostly what history is made out of, opinions, is that at some point between about 1900 and 1917, people within the Okhrana were playing their own game. And that game took them in a direction which meant that continued loyalty to the emperor, specifically to Nicholas II, was no longer part of that. To me, in a way, it seems almost during the events of 1917 that, one, you had an organization that was very effective when it did that suddenly just becomes ineffective. Doesn't really disappear. These things don't go away because it will reappear as the Ochaka basically fairly quickly. But it raises the question to me as to what degree there were people within the organization who allowed events to take the course they wished.